Hello and welcome to a new episode of Once Upon a TV Time, the podcast that takes a look behind the scenes of some of the best shows on TV. I'm your host, Marine Perot. I'm a freelance journalist and TV critic, and on each episode of this podcast, I chat with someone who worked or works on the shows we discuss. Writers, directors, actors, craftsmen, and women, you name it, they stop by to talk about what makes great TV and to tell us what goes on beyond our screens. This new episode of Once Upon a TV Time is a little unusual because it's about a brand new show that just came out on Netflix and adapts a beloved book series. Remember Little House on the Prairie? Not the 1973 show with Michael Landon. The books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, published in the 1930s and inspired by her own childhood on the American frontier. Well, it just got a new adaptation developed by Rebecca Sonnenschein.
Once upon a time, Ma and Pa and Mary and Laura left the big woods of Wisconsin and moved to the prairie, where a new life was waiting for them. Every day and every night was an adventure. And even though they were all alone and very small against the sky and the stars, they were happy because they were a family and they were together.
While Sonnenschein leads the adaptation as writer and showrunner, it's executive producer Gorman Wettels who saw an opportunity to reimagine this beloved story for a new generation, and she's here with me today to talk about this new iteration of Little House on the Prairie. Joy, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into your work on Little House on the Prairie, I'd like to talk about your role. You are known for being an executive producer on titles like 13 Reasons Why or Imprisoned, among others. But before we dive into the specifics of your career, can you explain to the listeners, because I feel like that's sometimes a term that's a little obscure to the layman, what is an executive producer and what is it that they do?
So in television, an executive producer is often a title that's used for a lot of different people. Not all of us do the same job. But in television, the executive producer is sort of the highest producer credit you can receive, whereas in film, the produced by credit is the highest credit you can receive. And in my role as executive producer on Little House and on a producer on the films that I've made, it means that I'm the originator of the project. It means I got the rights, found the writer, put the team together to get it made, brought it to a studio, brought it to a network, put the funding together with it, and so I like to think of a really strong producer, and we call ourselves, those of us who produce in that way, in that holistic way, and are creative, oversee a creative vision from start to finish, we call ourselves career producers, which means you're not getting a producer credit because you have family money and can write a check for an indie movie. You're not getting producer credit because you are the partner of a manager of a movie star, but you are getting producer credit because you've originated, packaged a project, and curated a team of artists who come together to make this project. And there are lots of different ways to be a producer, but that's the way that I'm a producer.
And is that something that you always wanted to do, work in television?
I always wanted to work in storytelling. I grew up loving theater. I grew up outside of New York City. You call us bridge and tunnel kids when you're not from Manhattan, but you're from kind of a working class part of New York outside of Manhattan. And so I went to the theater all the time, and I always wanted to be in storytelling. It was something my mother instilled in me, which is so funny. I'm wearing a chorus line t-shirt today. I didn't even realize that. But, I always knew that I wanted to connect, especially to young people. Like, I joke that I've been a teenager since I was 5 and I'm still a teenager because I've always wanted to tell stories that help young people feel like they're not alone and help bridge the gap between generations. And so whether it's theater, film, television, I just love bringing people together and bringing a story to them that makes them feel seen and heard.
So how did you end up where you are today, being an executive producer?
Oh my gosh, it was such a long road, Marine. It's kind of crazy. You know, it's interesting. When I was growing up in Yonkers, which is like right outside the Bronx in New York, and my mom always instilled in us this love of the arts and, you know, watching Bob Fosse and Neil Simon and Stephen Sondheim and like these incredible storytellers. My big sister was a Broadway actress and dancer. And, we just always loved going into New York City and watching stories and watching old movies. But it became pretty clear when I was going to college at Columbia, Barnard is the Women's College of Columbia, that it felt to me like you kind of had to have money to go into this business. And I didn't have that. And so I veered away from it. My mom was like, you're going to have to pay back your school loans. I don't know how you're going to go and be a filmmaker or whatever you want, and so we started to veer away from it. And then when I was at Columbia, there was a musical produced and written by students called The Varsity Show. And it had this 100-year tradition where Sondheim and Rodgers and Hammerstein and all of these huge legends had been a part of it. And I stumbled into it and I said, oh my God, I have to be a part of that. And even though I was working like 40 hours a week and like barely getting my classes in, I auditioned for that show. And I met a group of people who became my creative partners for life, and Brian Yorkie and Tom Kitt had written that show. And they ultimately wrote Next to Normal, which was recently on the West End and a big hit, and that we took 10 years to get to Broadway, and it got the Pulitzer and many Tony nominations, and I helped develop that with them, and I helped get that to Broadway. So that was sort of my entree into, I love being a creative partner to writers, to composers, to actors, to directors. I love being a person that can help translate what it is that they're putting on the page to people on the business side to say, this is why you have to give us money to make this, And I love defending and fiercely standing by their vision. And I also think I love being able to say, okay, we don't have the resources for this. What can we do? And so I think great artists need someone who sees their art, but also helps balance the other side. And that's what I fell in love with about producing.
Mm-hmm. So would that be your advice for somebody who is interested in being on the producing end of the TV industry, of the entertainment industry? Would it be that? Would it be find your tribe, find the people that you can collaborate with?
That's always my first piece of advice is like, I'm shooting a movie right now with my friend Alice Brooks, who's an incredible cinematographer, and she did the Wicked movies, and she met John Chu at USC. She shot his first 10-minute musical that was passed around. We didn't call it viral then because it was on a VHS tape, but in the early 2000s, she shot that. And I met her years ago because John Chu and Dana Fox and I were doing a pilot together. And he said, this is one of my best friends from college, and she's a genius, and I want her to shoot this pilot, And he stood by his best friend from college and said, this is my DP. She's a genius, at a time when it was so hard for female DPs to get approved. And we together fought for her to get that pilot. So it's not only that I found my tribe, but when I find other people with their tribe, it is just such an inspiring, beautiful thing, and you want to protect that. You want to protect that creative partnership. And I think that it's a combination, right? You find your tribe, but you're all kind of powerless until you're not, right? I mean, obviously, I think this generation has a lot more power than we did because you could really create your own audience online in a way that like we were learning how to write emails. That's how old I am. But it's also like finding a mentor, obviously, is a big part of it. And I don't know that mentors have to be what we used to think they are, right? It's like My mentor was Steve Golan, who produced The Revenant and Spotlight and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Being John Malkovich and movies that really shaped my life, And the way that he taught me was like, you know what you're doing. And I was like, no, I actually don't. Like it was like, no, you know what? Like he produced producers, right? By empowering us, by saying, it's not brain surgery. He used to go, it's a movie, not a secret. And, you know, I think part of it was that Steve also came from Yonkers, which is this like kind of working class place at the time and, outside of New York. And having somebody in Hollywood who had become kind of a mogul, but came from where I came from was this constant reminder that I could probably do this, that everything is possible if you believe. And as hard as it is, he was such a realist. He also really understood the below the line side. He really understood production. He could look at a schedule and piece it together in a better way so we could get the actor we wanted. And just watching that and being able to absorb that was an incredible and integral part of getting to do this for a living. And then when I brought him the right material, which was, Lorene Scafaria's first film, Seeking a Friend for the End of the World, we had that older man to make a big phone call to financiers and say, I got behind Spike Jonze's first movie and Cuarón's first movies. And so you got to believe me when I say this young woman director has got the goods. And having that big 800-pound gorilla to make that phone call and say, you can trust Joy and Lorene, was how we got Lorene's first movie made. And I learned every second on that movie. I was kind of thrown in and really learning. And I think as a filmmaker, so was Laura, and it was a beautiful movie and we learned so much from it. But it was really beautiful how Steve didn't try to control the situation. He was very like, you make your own mistakes. You protect the director's vision as much as you can. And that was the kind of mentorship that I think shaped me, and I really try to be a good mentor. Like, it's like one of the most important parts of this job for me is like knowing that the young people who come up and work for so little money and are paying off their school loans like I was are really seeing a path to their dreams coming true. And that's very hard right now in our business because the path is not as clear as it used to be.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I initially I went to school for film when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I did that. Yeah, I went to school for film in France where I'm from, and then in the US. And there was an element of that, of like trying to find your people. But quickly for me, the obstacle was you're not in the right place. Like, it was a sense of you need to be in LA or you need to be in New York, and that's not
True anymore.
Yeah, but and it was also
Right.
not. It's not also not possible for everyone.
Yeah.
There was that sense of like, how do you do it? And the fact that you mentioned like John Chu, who ended up making Wicked, they all have, like, if you dig a little bit, a lot of like those big storytellers now, they have those connections from college. So I think it's important to remind the younger generation that that's where it starts, really, where they can make those connections that will last a lifetime.
But I think this generation can make connections online in a way that we couldn't, like even in the music industry. Like, look at Leve. She's this Icelandic girl, who was a classical musician, and she put these jazzy old-timey standards online, and kids found her and loved her. And my daughter's in 8th grade and the boys she goes to school with are obsessed with her. That is not something that could have happened in the 90s, in the early aughts. And I think that there is for this generation, there's a new way to find your tribe and find community, because you can find fans and but I think what you're competing with, right, is the noise.
Yeah.
What you're competing with is how do you break through? And even I feel like that. And I'm an established, producer. But I think that my mom, back then in the 90s was like the way the only way you make it, the only way you get out is getting a scholarship to a fancy college. And you have to go to school with people that have more than you. And you have to go figure it out, go act like you have it already. And that was really hard because you come out of school with 100 grand of debt and you don't pay it off till your 40s. And it's like not, and I wouldn't put my daughter in that situation, because that was a really hard way to do it. But I will say that for my generation, being at the right school and meeting the right people was a big part of it. It was a big part of finding your tribe.
So beyond producing, you are also the founder of the Joy Coalition. Can you explain what that is?
Well, that's the name of my production company. And the reason I chose the word coalition is because I really believe that every story is so hard to get made, honestly, because I don't make Fast and the Furious and I don't make horror really. Everything that I make has to do with grief and joy and heartache and love and history and things that aren't like the most obvious. This is it. It's so obvious to see. It's not. I don't make boy stuff. And so you kind of have to fight for things that matter. It's a little harder to get the resources for things that matter. And so I often, like if I'm doing something in the mental health space or the social justice space or whatever issue is underneath what we're doing, I try to partner with organizations, with really the best consultants, like just to make sure that we're always representing people's authentic lived experience in our storytelling. And so I just came up with the name Joy Coalition because I wanted to tell people, we have to fight for our stuff to get made. We have to fight for people to be themselves in the world. And we want to show that in the stories that we tell. And also that, like, when it makes sense, we have a 501c3 or nonprofit side to our business where we can make sure that we're raising philanthropic funds to support the actual work that the movies and TV shows are going to inspire.
That's really cool. And it's kind of like showing that theme of, unity and collaboration and getting a group of people together and get things done.
Well, that's why I love that your podcast is about the craftspeople because, like, when I say you learn every single day on a set, like, I kind of can't believe because, like, I wasn't a person that loved school. I got good grades because I killed myself to get good grades, but like, I didn't love learning because I was like undiagnosed ADHD and always felt like if I didn't get an A, I was a failure, and getting to be on a set, especially when you're doing something historical, I can't believe what we learn every day. Like the girls, we have these wonderful greens girls on Little House who protect the grasses of the prairie and who put the wildflowers into, the sod house or in front of the cat. And they're just like these incredible artisans, and just being with my props people on both of these projects. They're like these young, wonderful historians who are just finding things from 1953 or 1869. Like it's inspiring every day to make a movie or to make a TV show because you're just surrounded by like these artists who love what they do. And there's something about when you only pick material that has some kind of meaning or opens people's hearts and makes them vulnerable, no one can deny that they want to show up on that set and do that hard job. Because, like for Little House, it's about the children. Everybody shows up and sees Alice and Skywalker and these angelic, adorable, wonderful kids and knows that they're playing real people who really existed in American history and that we have to be our best selves when we come to work. And so everybody from camera to props to costumes is just like doing their job with love. And it is the most rewarding and beautiful part of what I do is that like I can learn from a 28-year-old girl who makes logs, and like I didn't know that was a job until I got this show greenlit. You know what I mean? Like, and so there's something really special about the magic of movies and TV that like we get to build worlds and we get to be inside them and we get to learn from 300 different people
Yeah.
who have these very specific, jobs. And I mean, I could go on and on about our costume department on Little House on the Prairie. Like Mitchell Travers is an absolute genius and we've worked together before. And just the way he oversees the whole workshop and the way we had Lainey come from Oklahoma to do all the Osage ribbon work, and just the way he's so devoted to authenticity. It's so generous the way he creates costumes. It's just that there's a generosity of spirit and a love and community to how he's designing these costumes. And we're not a show with a ton of money. We're not getting Taylor Sheridan budgets here, And that's almost part of the beauty of it, right? Like it's almost like part of the fun of it is like figuring out how to make the most with a little bit less, I mean, we're still, I don't know. We just have a wonderful team.
Tell me, Mr. Ingalls, what brought you to this land?
A fresh start for my family.
I'm going to be honest with you. I have never watched the original show or the 1970s show.
That's actually great. No, that's really good because it's not about the original show. It's really about the books and the true history of the Ingalls.
Yeah, that's how I approached it. Plus, I'm a 90s kid. In the 90s, I was very big on Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. That was my show. In my house, it was...
She was so beautiful, right?
It was so great. And back then, there was kind of this, like, on TV in France, it was... Those were the two big Westerns. And so you were either watching one or the other in my book. And I was watching Dr. Quinn. And what's interesting to me is that the very first episode of the podcast, I interviewed Beth Sullivan, who created Dr. Quinn. And at the time, we talked about how she had toyed with the idea of rebooting the show a few years back. And she told me that when she pitched it to executives, they told her, no, it's a bit dusty. And so my question to you is, how did you find a way to dust off Little House on the Prairie and give it a new life?
Well, I think that, my Achilles heel in life and as a storyteller is that I have like a crazy amount of empathy. And I feel like sometimes I have a feeling in my gut of like what I think an audience is dying to see and hear that nobody agrees with me or believes is what they want. Do you know what I'm saying? And and it was 2020 when a show that I had originated just came out on Apple TV Plus, the one that John Chu directed with my friend Dana Fox and my friend Dara Resnick. And it was about a little girl and her father. And when I was trying to sell that show, which was also based on a true story, and the little girl was a writer. And when I was trying to figure out how to sell that story, I kept Googling father-daughter stories. And I have an adorable husband and a little girl at the time, she was 8. She's now 14. And I was like, God, all they could watch together really is like Marvel or Coco and beautiful Pixar movies over and over again. But like when I would Google father-daughter story, the only thing that would come up was Little House on the Prairie. So I went back to the books because obviously anything that is about the settling of the American West is going to be very sensitive. And I was like, I wonder how Laura dealt with, and this was 2020, this was during the racial reckoning, and I was actually making a documentary with a lot of the, with some of the Black Lives Matter co-founders and like very deep in the social justice conversation. And I reread the book, and Laura, I mean, these books are written in the 1930s. Laura was in her 60s when she wrote them with the help of her daughter, Rose. And she was writing them trying to say, you can get through the Depression the way that I got through this time. Like, we had nothing. We were surviving. We were scared, but we had love. We had community. And when I was reading the book to my daughter with her, she was 8, and she was like, why are they saying, negative things about the Indians? And why are they calling them that? Like, they're Native Americans. And, and it was really eye-opening to read them with a modern cosmopolitan child who goes to a charter school in Hollywood. You know what I mean? And Laura turns to her parents, 8 years old. Now, also think it's 1932 when a 65-year-old woman is writing herself as a child, saying this to her parents. And she says, why did we come here to Indian country if we didn't want to know them? That was it. That's not Dusty.
Mm-hmm.
That was the North Star. That was like that. And then when I started to read all the surrounding historical texts like Prairie Fires and Pioneer Girl, Laura said because for so long people said, well, they're not really true stories. And then they got sort of reclassified as fiction because when you tell stories of your childhood, you're telling them through rose-colored glasses. You're not going to be like, and then my mother hit me. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
So we all kind of, we could tell the story of our trauma or we could tell the story of how we survived it. This is how she chose to tell it. But Laura also said, I told the truth. I didn't tell the whole truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, it's 2020. People are ready for the whole truth, right? For some fictionalized version of the whole truth. And what does that look like? And then you pitch that to the rights holder, Trip Friendly, who's a wonderful man, whose dad made the original series. And he was really committed to making sure that this was told from the perspective of Laura, because Michael Landon's beautiful show, which we all grew up on and loved, really was Pa was the savior. And I started to watch the show with my daughter after we read the first 2 books, or the first and the third book. And she said, again, 8 years old, why is this guy always saving everybody? And I'm like, isn't he handsome? And she's like, you have a husband. And I'm like, but look at Michael Landon. And my husband's laughing. And I'm like making him build a fire for us outside and calling him Pa, And my daughter was like, why is he always saving everybody? I thought Laura wrote the books.
Mm-hmm.
And so for those 2 reasons, I love going back to original material, to old material with my daughter and her friends in mind, and this generation in mind, and saying like, what are they not getting? What are they not seeing? What are we, forgetting that they need to know? And it just felt like we were in this moment where the entire world was trying to learn how to bake bread and grow vegetables and be home with their families and survive. And it just felt so universal. And I think my husband would be okay with me telling this story. But also, as I was doing all the deep research, I realized, Pa made a lot of mistakes, like business mistakes. Like,
Yeah.
he put his family in danger and he had a lot of failure. And I think that the adaptation that we all loved growing up, Pa didn't really make a lot of mistakes. He was a wonderful guy and he found the way to do things right. And I think a lot of parents were losing jobs and not knowing how to survive in that time. And in the aftermath of it all, 6 years later, it's still, kind of hard to bounce back for a lot of people who were raising children in COVID. And my husband had a real setback in his work where like he had a startup company and the investors closed the LA office and everything moved to Denmark where their company could be funded, and he was out of a job. And I was like, this is so many dads right now. And wouldn't it be beautiful for them to be able to sit and watch something that feels like Gilmore Girls-ish, but speaks to that feeling of a parent trying to be a provider and failing, and how you use that to teach your children resilience and to teach them to believe in love and community rather than focus on lack and hate because of the fear that's around. And so for all those reasons, I didn't find it dusty. Now that like I'm in the 2nd season working on the Prairie, it's very dusty. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's dust in your nose when you leave. You got to wear tick socks. It's not beautiful. I don't know why they went there, but it is. No, it is very beautiful, but it is very hard. Rebecca, our showrunner, was like, "You don't really love nature, do you, Joy?" And I was like, "I loved being a kid in the city, reading the books and imagining nature, but man, nature's really hard."
Yeah, it's quite different from New York, I can imagine.
I've seen entire families freeze to death out here. Get taken by fever, wolves. It is a myth that men can make it out here alone.
So tell me about the journey to get this show on Netflix.
So we, without boring you with all the corporate machinations of what's been going on in Hollywood since 2020, we originally, Anonymous Content and Paramount Television originally bought the rights for us to develop. And then we were developing that over the course of a couple of years. We brought in our Osage consultants very early on. We brought in Robert Warrior, who is from the University of Kansas and is one of the leading Osage scholars, because I knew and Tripp agreed that a way to not make this dusty, a way to make this really relevant, is to include the perspective of the Osage. And we wanted to do that in a way that wasn't through just the white family's lens. And it just took so much research to kind of balance, how can we do that? How can we do that in a way? And we tried to find, when you are building a show from the ground up, you have to find a writer who is advanced enough that they can create and run a show. And so we tried for a long time to find that person. And once Robert said to us, yes, it's possible to put a mixed blood Osage family into the story. Also, I was very excited. Another thing that I knew made it not dusty was that Dr. Tan was in the book. Was in this book, in the Little House on the Prairie book. And that here was this Black doctor who treated both the Osage and white settlers, and how kind of, surprisingly progressive was that for the time, and to write about that in the 30s seemed kind of progressive. So we really had to find a writer who could look at this really courageously and give every potential representative of Independence, Kansas, who might be in the census and exist, kind of a perspective. And a young executive I worked with at the time, her name is Cabrina, she's so smart. She said, I wonder if we should be looking at genre writers, because so many people in this moment in the world were kind of afraid to do anything that was glorifying the settling of the West and America. And we're trying to just put too much political spin on it, that we wanted to be honest, but we wanted to create something that could create a dialogue between families, between generations, that from age 8 to 80, you could sit and watch this show together and have a conversation about where are the Osage coming from, and where are the Ingalls coming from, and where is Dr. Tan coming from? And what is it like to live in the aftermath of war? This is just a few years after the Civil War. People were really suffering, and for a good cause, for a good reason, And so Rebecca Sonnenschein was the person, and it took a long time to find her. It took a couple of years, because you really needed somebody who could see the entire picture and create characters with humanity. And I think the key not only was that she is a genre writer and could build worlds, and look at this with that kind of distance, but she lived inside these books. These books made her a writer. And it was so cool to find this woman who's a horror, thriller, genre writer, and was an EP on The Boys and wrote my husband's favorite episodes of The Boys, and have her say, I'm obsessed with Little House on the Prairie, And I had just watched her show Archive 81. That's super cool and feels like 8 indie movies, it's so, and I was like, this cool girl loves Little House. She's going to give it a non-dusty spin. She's going to give it an edge that it needs. And we can also help infuse it with that heart and soul and warmth and love and ribbons and bonnets that the world needs and wants from that title, but that she would bravely kind of paint a picture where everybody's just a human who's trying to survive, and she did.
It's interesting what you said about the representation of the frontier and pioneers and settlers back then. There is lately in the shows we've seen, it's been 1883, so Taylor Sheridan's vision of the West. There's been American Primeval on Netflix as well, which is very gritty, very, very dark. And nothing is really for a young audience. Nothing is really to put in front of everybody's eyes because there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of
Exactly.
hurt. And Little House on the Prairie comes in and it's all nice. Not nice in the way of there's hardship, there is challenges, there is trauma, but it's a family show at its core. But
right.
I wondered, who is your ideal viewer? Is it somebody who has no knowledge of Little House on the Prairie? Is it someone who cherishes the books and the old show, or perhaps a mix of both?
It's a mix of both. I would say there are so many fans of the original series that I think a lot of them have never even seen or touched the books and think it was a creation of Michael Landon's brilliant mind. So those are probably going to be the people that are hardest to get. But that show had 200 plus episodes. It was on for 11 years. You're almost comparing two different genres, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like comparing a song to a movie. Like we don't have the number of hours or any of the, it's just a totally different platform, to do 8 episodes on streaming. So I really want to discourage people from comparing us to the original show. We all love the original show, but we tried to really, really differentiate from the original show and let it remain its own beautiful thing that was culture changing in the 70s and shaped so many of us and is still a beautiful watch. The lovers of the books, I always, when I look at an adaptation from 13 Reasons to this, to The Bell Jar, to any book, I always think of the real scholars and the real hardcore lovers of the books first. And you just want to you want to honor the literature as much as possible, but also make sure you're giving yourselves, the team, the creative permission to open the aperture and change the point of view of how you're going to present this to an audience. But little details like Pa making that chair, like the things that, or the sod house in the next book that's on the cover of that book, like you want to really give the lovers of the books those special moments, because there are especially women my age who've loved these books since they were little. And I think that the beauty of books that have been around for almost 100 years is that there are grandmothers who read this to their kids who are still alive, who read this to their grandkids. There are, it really should be for ages 8 to 80. Like it really should feel the way that, like, when I was growing up, you could watch Stand By Me, or you could watch E.T., or you could watch real people across generations dealing with really hard, sad things, but feel hope. And so that, I think, our hope is to have all of those audiences see beauty in it and see themselves in it. And then the other thing was that we really wanted to try and, Independence was this very tiny brand new town. Pa says, well, isn't this what you wanted? We wanted to be at the beginning of something. And it's kind of a little utopia. There's conflict that's very real, but we wanted to show, like I was saying before, we wanted to show family audiences that fear doesn't have to turn into hate, that we're all human beings, and especially children. When you're looking at war and disputes over land and all of these very difficult, awful, issues that every single country has dealt with since the beginning of civilization and still are. If you take 2 little girls who are 10, they want the same thing. They want a box of kittens. They want to play. And what if you kind of took these really difficult historical moments and let that be the central point of view. Those of what children deserve, of what children need. And then I would also like to address the part about the Taylor Sheridan and the American primevals of the world, because it is, as a woman producer, filmmaker, it is amazing how the budgets and the resources that are thrown at, and these are wonderfully, beautifully made shows, American Primeval, 1883. In order to hire our Osage consultant, who was our on-set consultant, Julie O'Keefe, you have to go through a lot of approvals and find out how much it costs to hire people to do certain things. I learned a lot about the budgets of the things that were led by men who were established filmmakers that she had worked on before. And I was like, whoa, we don't have that, and God bless Julie. She was like, oh, I get it. I'm going to come do that work for you, even though you can't give us what even though you don't have the resources that Killers of the Flower Moon or American Primeval had. I believe in what you're doing and I'm going to come and work with you. And so it was kind of like it's kind of like when I was making independent films with Lorene Scafaria, and she and I would send these impassioned letters to get Beyonce to give us a song because we only had $3 million for the entire movie. It was like people who are used to working in the more Taylor Sheridan, Pete Berg space where you're given 3 or 4 times the budget to do the same, time period. We're willing to take less to be a part of this beautiful story that's women-led and about love and community and not about war and fighting. But it is interesting to me how just our business really finances violent male-driven things much more than, more easily than something like this. But then look, they loved, Netflix loves our show and gave us an early season 2, and they're just so behind it and they love it so much. And we're so lucky for that. But, you have to kind of prove yourself a bit more than you would if you were a big, cool dude making very violent pictures of the American West. That's just a little more commercially viable to corporate Hollywood.
Are you getting a bigger budget for season 2?
I mean, just you get a little, you get a little bit of a bump, but we're getting the support that the marketing campaign is beautiful. We're just getting, it's such a huge vote of confidence and a huge, beautiful act of support to give a show a season 2 before season 1 comes out. It's really unheard of right now. It's definitely happened to me before because I make shows with kids and sometimes you have to beat the clock, but we have incredible partners in Netflix. We're actually so lucky in terms of how much they believe in our show. So I hope we're right, guys. I hope all of you watch it and get us.
I mean, I'm going to give you my honest opinion. So I saw all of it. And as I said, I wasn't no prior knowledge. So I went in blind, basically. I had very little knowledge of the Ingalls family. And I found the show to be very compelling and well made. And at the end of it, I was glad to know that there's already season 2 because I was like, I want to know what happens next. I want to know where they go next and what trouble they're going to run into, because there is, like you said, this, it's full of hope. It's a theme that goes throughout the first season, right? It's full of hope and optimism, and it's refreshing to see in that kind of setting that it's not just like the 2 shows that we mentioned before. It's not just hardship, constant, and everybody dies and everybody massacres everybody. No, it's some people made it and they struggled, but they made it. And that's how America as we know it now became what it is. It's because of those people who settled and moved across the country. And I think, not to get political, but in the world that we live in now, it's important to have those stories told in such a heartwarming way. But as I say that, my next question is going to be about mental health. Because what I found interesting is something that, if you've mentioned, that's very present in your work overall. And it is present in this show. Like you said, you were talking earlier about how Pa in the Michael Landon show or in the books is like this hero. And what I found interesting to see in your version is that he has flaws and he has he makes mistakes and he realizes that he's making mistakes, but also he's carrying a weight. He's carrying the trauma of the war, of things that
losing George.
Yes, stuff that have happened with his family. And so I wanted to ask why it was important to you to have that element of like the mental struggles that come with their journey, to have that in the show.
Because I think we look back at history and we pretend that depression just came up like since 1960s or something. You know, like I'm like an obsessive Sylvia Plath lover, and I was doing a project years ago called Overlooked with the New York Times that didn't get ordered ultimately. But when I learned that Sylvia Plath didn't get an obituary in the New York Times because she died by suicide, you know, and so the more, you know, since Next to Normal and 13 Reasons Why, I've always had this sense of it is so important in film and television and music. We have the power to reach inside people's souls and have them feel a connection. And it's just really important to represent how normal it is to be living through grief and having to survive through grief, to be living with trauma inside you. And it's like, frankly, I didn't tell Rebecca to come up with the story of Pa's brother or any of that stuff. It was just what she, you know, that was her and the writer's instinct. But I also knew that we all knew that in order to live this way and survive, there was going to be a lot of loss and grief. Like most people had fought in the Civil War, like most men had fought in the Civil War. So, you know, we just wanted to try to be as realistic as possible about what it's like to carry the burden of loss, of poverty. That was another thing for me. And this is, I believe, mental health related. I think we talk too much about a vague picture of mental health, especially with our youth. And I'm like, oh, so do we think the Calm app is going to save a kid because they can't pay their rent, because they can't get a job, because they can't pay for college? You know what I mean? Like having life skills, having the ability to survive, having resilience creates good mental health, you know? And so I think that was also a piece of it, was like to see how Pa and the girls kind of reach for love and connection to survive their grief, to survive their loss, is something that I just thought would be really healing for audiences. And we all thought would be like healing for audiences and like a good reminder. I think especially young people are very alone nowadays. You know, I think there's just a lot of loneliness. There's a loneliness epidemic among men. That was one of the reasons we really wanted to show these like manly, very handsome men who hug each other and who say, I want you here, you know? And I love the relationship between Pa and Edwards. I love when Dr. Tan says to Pa, men can't make, you know, it's a myth that men can make it out here alone. And that was another reason I loved this, was I was working with the Surgeon General's, the former Surgeon General's office, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is just a brilliant man who really made youth mental health his, you know, during his time in the Biden White House, the youth mental health was a big priority for him. And I worked on an initiative with other Hollywood folks about how we can respond to the youth mental health crisis. And he said, please, young men need more, and little boys need more stories of resilience through community and connection. He said that boys stop saying, I love you, or you're my best friend, and being affectionate to each other around 10 to 12, 13 years old. And that's when they're finding porn on the internet and like manosphere content and dark negative stuff. And he was like, the more you can, as storytellers, put out stories that dispel this myth of men can do it alone, and men went out west and they fought and they won, and like show stories of love and connection with masculine characters, that would be really helpful. And so that was another reason why I was kind of obsessed with like, what could our new version of Pa be if we did a new version of Little House on the Prairie? And I think Rebecca and the writers just nailed that so beautifully.
So tell me about the casting of Luke Bracey as Pa.
Isn't he just the greatest?
He's pretty great.
It's funny. Before we had a green light, because when you're a producer, you're like, I'm going to do whatever I can to get a green light. Rebecca and I were like, we're just going to staff the room. We're just going to meet writers and pick them. I was introducing her to writers a year before we had a green light. Before we even sold it to Netflix, I was like, you have to meet Eleanor Burgess because you're going to love her, And it was actually my friend Barbara, who was at the time the head of casting at Hulu, said, you know who your Pa is? It's Luke Bracey. And he was a friend of hers. And she said, you need an Australian to play Pa. She said, because they're old fashioned, they're masculine, they live in the sun, they're rugged. And she said, and Luke has this beautiful heart. Like, he's the best number one on a call sheet you could ever ask for, because he always shows up early. He always shows up with a smile. He always knows his lines. And then months later, we went through the whole audition process, and he was all the way in Australia making Dodger, and, was, so busy he could barely make his audition tape. And it was just that, like, there were so many wonderful guys, who could have been Pa. And it was just, there were such tough shoes to fill. And so many different wonderful guys came close that it was like, there was something about Luke that, even though you didn't even get to meet him in person until 8 days before shooting, it was all over Zoom. This is all done over Zoom. So you're just like lucky that they show up and have a pair of legs, because you never even saw them below their chest. And he just was kind of perfect. And the thing about Luke too is he has a perspective on, he loves Winston Churchill. He loves world history. He loves like geopolitics. He's a big reader. And he had just a love and an understanding of like American history for a guy that's from a different country, that he brings to it. And he just kind of, it's hard to describe, but he was meant to be Pa. He was the perfect choice.
Before I let you go, I can't let you go before I ask you about Laura and Caroline and Mary. Like, tell me about finding those.
Oh my God, I have to
characters.
quickly tell you about all of my girls. We love them so deeply. Alice might be the reincarnation of the actual Laura Ingalls Wilder, because her wisdom is out of control. The things that come out of her mouth are just, it's like, oh, you wrote these 9 books, I guess. She just has, she's just like, she's dramaturgical in how she approaches the material, and she's a child. She's just got she's wise beyond her years. There's something just very, very otherworldly about her, and it's something that you only see a few times in a generation of actor. And she's very, very special. And she reminds me a lot of Brooklyn Prince, who worked on Home Before Dark with me, who also was this kind of wise little 8-year-old that you just couldn't believe what came out of her mouth. She was, in the Florida Project. And so she's just, Alice is one of those kids you can't even believe. Skywalker is such a Mary Ingalls. She's the oldest sister of a family of 5. She lives on a farm in Canada outside of Toronto. She rides horses. She read the books and knew them by heart. She's, again, like from another time. She loves to read. She loves to write music. She loves to sing. She loves to create. Like, she's so crafty and old-timey, and yet this cool, awesome little soon-to-be movie star girl. My daughter and Skywalker are pretty close in age, and last summer she was trying to teach Rosemary how to crochet. I mean, they're just amazing. And Crosby, I mean, she's become like a little sister to me. Crosby was such a find, because we were looking for Ma to just have a quiet depth to her. And Crosby's actually the most hilarious person on earth. Like she could have been on Saturday Night Live, which is why it's like so crazy that she looks like this 1869 gorgeous, prairie woman living in the sun who can make you cry at the drop of a hat and can survive anything. But she is just a super deep actress. She doesn't seem like she's trying. If you remember that scene in episode 2 where Pa gets angry with her for sending Edwards away, like that beautiful fight about her father's death and all of that. And you're like, you yell cut. And she's like, she's still a girl in her early 30s. You know what I mean? Like she's still, and you're like, how do you do that? But she does the work. She studies, she reads everything, and she's the mommy. She says, Luke, this is what we have to read. This is what we're going to watch. They watched Friday Night Lights together so that they could work on their Coach and Tammy kind of dynamic. And she's just always kind of taken this beautiful maternal approach to her role also on set, also with the other actors and with the kids. And she's just a true caretaker. She's been her money job for years was being a nanny and a house manager. And so she's taking care of so many people's children that it's ironic, or not ironic, but it's like, it makes sense that she would be, America's Ma. And the coolest, prettiest, most fun, youthful version of that. But I mean, we're so lucky, like Rebecca and all of us, we are so thankful every day that we have the most loving cast. We always say the dogs and the horses, those are the hard casts. Those are the divas we have to worry about. All the humans on this set are angels.
Is Jack a good boy?
Jack's a good boy. There's many Jacks. There are many, many Jacks. I think all dogs are angels. Not all dogs feel like acting when you need them to act. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Sometimes you put peanut butter on a child's face and he's like, I don't want to kiss you. I don't know. So, every set has a little bit of a diva, but we've got many, many Jacks, and some of them are doing great.
Oh, that's awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me and talking about what's happening on the prairie.
Thank you so much for having me, Marine. This was really a fun conversation.
It's the end of this episode of Once Upon a TV Time. Thank you so much for listening. Joy Gorman Wettels, thank you very much for taking a stroll around the prairie with me. Little House on the Prairie is now streaming on Netflix. Folks, I will be back with a new episode of Once Upon a TV Time and a new guest. Stay tuned, follow this podcast on social media for all the details. Leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcast, and until then, go watch some television.